so thrilled that you're still all here and so energetic. And this is our last panel of the day. Reverend Sierra Bates Chamberlain is in the house, so we're going to have closing remarks from her and then send you off for lunch. I'm delighted to be here today with Teny Gross, who leads the Institute for Nonviolence Chicago, Eddie Bocanegra, who leads READI Chicago, and Vanessa DeReef, who is the amazing lead trainer, director of training at the Metropolitan Peace Academy. And we're here to talk about where do we go next. I said we weren't going to identify a particular strategy or solution to the problem, but we're going to try. We're going to, try to put some good ideas out there that we can build upon and leverage upon. So, team, our audience here and on the line have had the opportunity to hear about the outreach experience and just the astronomical levels of trauma, stress, risk that these young adults go through on a regular basis. You've heard from Dallas's panel, the import between and the relationship between research and practitioners to help develop the field, help the field grow and get stronger. And I think the thing that we still struggle with is really this tension that is always there. I talked about it a little bit in the opening, that we have an urgency to address the issues that are happening every day, to address the gun violence that's happening every day, the trauma that's happening every day. And we need to have the patience to build the infrastructure to really see sustainable growth and success, quote unquote. You as leaders in your organizations in this space, how do you reconcile that tension? And how do you talk about that tension to a general audience, to funders, to policymakers? What do you do with that tension? And how about you, Teny? Why don't you start?
Okay. Good to be here. Thank you, N3, for convening us. We are in a very unique moment. Sort of in my lifespan, it's been 30 years to build legitimacy, rebuild, as the history shows, rebuild the legitimacy of outrage. And finally, it's on the lips of the White House through Eddie and some colleagues. But we also know our society is fickle, right? And now that violence is up, people want again go to what they know. It's almost an abused society. And let me go back to police and jail. So with our teams, we had 3 very good years when we started and built the architecture in Chicago. And suddenly we got hit with this tsunami. And our team is on some level both exhausted and demoralized. I went to sleep at 3:30 this morning. We had a shooting on the 25th district. And there's been more bodies that they see, right? So that reality is there. And we had a lot of injuries among staff and their families as well. A staff member whose daughter was killed in a suburb delivering sandwiches in a catering business, in a carjacking. And we had quite a few. So in that time frame, we're now supporting the team and working, and we're going to make some pretty drastic changes around wellness. And again, Catherine and Kelly and Eddie and everyone else, and your surveys have really helped us focus on that. What is wellness for leadership? What does it really mean to us? It's not a buzzword, it's not a fad. I hope outreach is not a fad. I hope trauma is not a fad. And I hope that wellness is not a fad, that we go deep. And that's sort of where we're trying to do. We cannot lose heart. It took many, many years, maybe 400 years, to build the conditions we're in. We're not just going to switch from law enforcement to building a civilian architecture and hope it's going to face also a tsunami when we haven't yet built. We built sandcastle yet. We're trying to put the cement next. We build the outline of the structure. And now we're getting those 2 years of reversal. And we're asking the media, we're asking funders, we're asking society. We need to reach out to voters who are not involved in the neighborhoods we work with to understand. Because They see on the 11 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news, 2 young black males with a mask robbing someone, carjacking in a gas station. The instinct is, do something about it. Send the police, 911. And for us to explain there's a slower process to reverse that involves justice and long-term solution, is a tough sell at the moment, but that's what we got to do. Sorry, I was wrong.
No.
Well, there's definitely a lot that we could do today. And I think some of the panelists earlier really pointed out a number of different things about taking the lessons that we've learned. You know, when I heard Andy opening up, I was thinking about Thrasher doing a lot of studies here in Chicago around gangs and how many gang cliques and groups existed back then, and how has that actually changed. But it's unfortunate, right, that while gangs might have morphed and developed in different ways, some of the principles that we look at to addressing these issues really haven't changed. Some for good reasons, right? Like engagement individuals, like throughout street outreach and what it takes to do so. But we're also in a point right now in our history where our country's reckoning with these issues around race and equity, as an example. And so what does that mean for us in this room and for the field of gun violence that includes street outreach as a primary starting point to address this issue? So we have an opportunity here today to really make some changes there, to take some of the best research academics, right? Like N3, the Crime Lab, David Olson out of Loyola, Chapin Hall, so many other local agencies, right, or institutions that are doing this work, and to build upon those lessons and to build upon the people who are doing the work as well. I think we have a lot of opportunities there. It's an underdeveloped field, as it's been noted quite well throughout today. And there's definitely some, again, great examples of what we're seeing of that particular development. I think about the work that's being done at MFS with the Outreach Academy there as a great, excellent starting point. But there's still a lot more work that we have to do. And we have to continue to evolve, give ourselves enough grace, and to think about this approach that we're taking, again, through a real way of looking at equity, which I hope we could talk more about in just a second.
So Soledad, when you briefed the question, you talked about tension. And, you know, from this work, we understand that the tension has been there for years. And I think the pandemic really magnified. But I think what we're very grateful for is that we did have a network of support in place. I think the networks that we did have in place, had we not had them and the pandemic happened, we probably would have seen a lot more disparities, you know, in our communities. However, you know, thinking about the tension really kind of helps us position the outreach workers at the academy. Like, how do you create a training that is not simply compliance-based, not simply one where they're sitting there with their hands folded, but they actually can sit in a space of safety, knowing that these individuals have been exposed to trauma, both indirectly and directly in the work that they see, but in their personal and lived experience as well. So you still want to, as I often say, you want to meet your bottom line, but how you do that, understanding that you're dealing with humans, you're not dealing with robots, right? And you're dealing with individuals who come to you with different literacy levels. And I come from an educational background. And so that was very important. And so how do you create a space of safety, but at the same time, you're dealing with these individuals who go out and they interrupt violence every day, right? And they are exposed to these traumatic instances every day, both in their professional and sometimes in their personal spaces. And so what we do at the Academy, before we talk about the best practices and before we talk about those strategies, before we talk about those procedures and protocols, we get to know the people who are doing the work. And so we build community. So we're in there getting to know one another. We take, 30 to 45 minutes every day. Imagine coming to a space, a professional learning community every day, and we're asking you, how are you doing? Not necessarily what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you, right? So we can really get to the root of the matter, and we build a space of safety as a result. And so over the course of 18 weeks, we develop a professional learning community where we kind of feel like a family. And so we're more trusting, because we are supporting one another, because we are encouraging and empowering one another in that space, we are able to talk about those traumatic instances. We are more able to kind of massage what it needs to happen with these tensions that we see in our community. So we're not necessarily, I wouldn't say that the tension is a surprise, but because we know through the public health model that violence spreads. So we should expect certain things, not necessarily happy to see it or receptive as a result of it, but at the same time, understanding that the manifestations are definitely going to arise, especially given the conditions.
So Vanessa, thank you for bringing up the humanity of the work, right? Because, and I want to stick with that thread for the next question and the pivot. One of the things that we hear a lot when we're talking about how do we go to scale, how do we sustain the gains that that the field as a profession is starting to see. One of the things that we hear a lot is more resources, meaning more financial resources, more dollars, right? Which is unquestionably needed. But I've heard you talk about resources also in the context of human beings and the people that we're talking about. So when you all think about resources and what more the field needs, what more community violence intervention needs, and you think about dollars, but you think about resources, what other kinds of resources do we really need to be advocating for, or what are the gaps that are still existing that we need to still see? And Vanessa, I'll start with you since you started down the path of humans.
So when I think about that question, I speak a lot about the power of the human resource. I come from like I said, an educational background, but I also study organizational development, and you have to deal with your people in order to see a return on your investment, so to speak. And so in addition to the policies that we advocate for, in addition to those legislative moves, we also cannot negate the power of the human resource. A lot of what we speak about at the Academy talks about the trauma that we experience. And so in order to support individuals who have been impacted by trauma, we talk about the trauma-informed approach. And how do we align the trauma-informed approach with the work that street outreach workers are doing each and every day? And so when we talk about that safety and developing that trust and that transparency, those particular elements are free. They cost much of nothing, and they come from the human resource. And so to answer your question, in addition to the policies and the legislation, because that keeps our programming going, we also can never really negate the fact of the power of the human resource, because that makes us resilient. Mm-hmm. The reason that we talk about the trauma-informed approach, and we really, that's one of the pillars to our work, is because at the end of it, it really builds resilience. And so what we hope to see in our communities is not necessarily just survival, but thriving. We've been surviving for so long, right? So now we're hoping with our model that we'll see individuals thrive beyond the point where they were originally.
Thank you, Eddie.
This is one of my favorite subjects. And the reason why is you heard from the earlier panelists talk about outward mobility. And so the perspective that I bring here, right? I grew up in the West Side of Chicago, was involved in the gang at a very young age, witnessed many shootings and homicides, went to prison for a violent offense, did 14 plus years in prison. I come home, get my undergraduate degree, go to grad school at UFC, doing street outreach work, community organizing, writing, academic, co-publishing, and then here I am running a large anti-violence program. And there's a perspective that I want to continue to just beat the drum on. And that is that if you would have asked me 10 years ago in that position that I was in, what do we need in this field? I probably would say more money and more frontline staff. And maybe I would say we need more trainings for that frontline staff. If you asked me 5 years ago, when I was an executive director of the Y, what would I need? My answer would also been very different. Today, as someone who is able to see other programs and models across this country and pick the brains of many professionals, I would say that where we need to disrupt the system and really put some stock is the way that we are investing in organizations in their back office support. Because the literature also tells us that when you're able to build on that back office support, your frontline staff will receive the kind of support they actually need. And that translates to better quality of service. Better quality of service is something that we don't always measure. We say we do, but we don't measure. I'll give you an example. We might say within our READI outreach, I'm going to make up a number, but we'll say we did 300 home visits in the month of November. We could say, as of October of 2019, we've done 47,000 hours of cognitive behavioral therapy or cognitive behavioral intervention. That's great. For most people, that's amazing to say that story. But when you dig in deeper, what's the quality of that service? What's the quality of that home visit? What's the quality of the CBI? And in doing so, I would tell you, we've been doing this for about almost 5 years, is that you need to also coach the coaches who are implementing this. You need to provide support systems for the managers and directors who are leading these efforts. And that is acknowledging their trauma. It is acknowledging that there might be some gaps in the way they're receiving information and the way that gets translated, and how much are we putting on their plates? Because too often, when I think about Teny, he's wearing 10 different hats as an ED. That's also unfair for him. But those are the conditions that our systems have created, both in government and philanthropy. But also, it's the way that we tell our stories and the way that we value this kind of work, or we don't. And I'm a critic when I see government and I think about their budget, and I could determine your values based on where your money's at. As one prime example. The other thing that I would say that is part of, like, as we're building this field, is the importance of collaboration and coalition building. One of the things that I'm at awe at Von Bryan is because it's very difficult to build coalition. Can you imagine supporting 22, 25, 30 organizations, all with their own EDs, their own culture? That's a challenge. Now think about when you're thinking about quality and fidelity to a service. Now it gets even more complex. So part of this is how we build in the field, not only on the front end, which is important, but the support systems that are needed for those people to do their work.
Thank you, Eddie. Teny?
So I want to build on what's been said. Yesterday, I got an email from Square One, Arnold Foundation, a prominent research think tank that tried to reimagine justice. And they were telling how we need to retell the story. So I'm going to speak a bit as a guilty person. I feel like a dinosaur sometimes. I come from scarcity. It was just great if I could put a few outreach workers out there. So we couldn't even ask for mental health for our team. So we would hug them and love them and go to their houses, and if a crisis, and we were there too, but we were generalists. To see now that with the coalition building, and I love how Vaughn said today, agency, right? Our teams are now, our partnership have more clout because it's not an individual empire, that we can ask for things that are right. I hope to live to the point where we're no longer heroic. We're just plain boring and doing the work that needs to be done, that the community is healthy, right? That we've lived in this heroic phase of showing late at night, taking risks, having guns pointed at us, saving lives. It's not a smart way to do things, right? And we're building now the opportunities. So I was slow with my co-leader, Lisa. She really saw the need to build, that we've constantly hired more and more frontline. I had that from the East Coast when I worked there. Every time I got money, let's hire more outreach workers, right? Of course, right? You want to be kind to the opportunity is so precious to the community. You want to do the right thing, but you really are shortchanging the people in the long term, right? Like our team, we just have, the academy is finishing. I think tomorrow is maybe the last class for this round. We have someone very experienced who worked for Ceasefire as a supervisor, absolutely loves the academy, loves the relationship, loves the cross-city coalition building and learning from each other. And I'm still afraid, as Sister Anna, founder in Nonviolence in Providence, said that things are a fad. I'm still afraid, like, is this really going to continue? Is this going to happen? And that shows my age. But there's younger people in the field that are like, yeah, they're demanding. And I'm like, yes, here you go, take the stick, run with it. This needs to be, someone, I think maybe Joseph was saying, glacial movement, right? We're impatient. So some of the changes we're going to do now is really try and look at how 2022 looks. What can we need to change? And in that, another thing to welcome in this coalition, Eddie is a critic. He's an internal critic. He's a great thinker. And some people will sometimes recoil from that, but we're not going to get better unless we have a culture that is critical. I don't agree with him on all of us. They always make me think. The defund the police movement, I'm not on the defund, but they make me imagine Was my dedication all my life to building bridging with law enforcement and reforms and believing the best of us? Maybe it falls short. I had to reimagine and visit that. That's a good thing. We want to have multiple voices in this movement. And we know we don't have all the answers. But one thing I do know, partially on instinct, partially on 30 years experience, the civilian architecture will deliver a different country if it's allowed to thrive. On that, I have no doubt the community has the answer if it gets the support. There's a lot of love and a lot of people who want to help and already helping without the resources. So we got to also trust our society and support it.
And I can rest assure you that the Academy will continue.
There you go.
As long as the outreach workers continue to validate it. We have George Matos here from cohort 1, Damian Morris here from cohort 1. And if they hadn't validated it, back in 2018, saying this is a quality necessary piece, we wouldn't be here today. And so they continue to have those experiences. The current cohort, our 8th cohort of outreach workers, they just told me, I think this week, that they wanted to extend it for a year because they don't want it to end. So it's since they continue to have that qualitative feedback, that's what we love to hear.
Absolutely. I want to go back to the issue of equity. Eddie, you raised it. And I think we talk about equity. When we talk about equity, we're not always talking from the same definition, or we're thinking about it at a very high level. How do you think about equity in this work, in this space, when you're advocating for whatever additional resources the field needs, or critiquing the field? Yeah. What does equity mean to you? And this is a question to all of you. What does equity mean to you? And what does it mean in this context for you?
So I guess I think about equity. Teny talked about working in scarcity, right? Like, I grew up in a neighborhood that's really poor, rich, second, last time I heard was second in terms of revenue next to the Michigan Avenue, Magnificent Mile. But when you look around, there's people who are just barely making it, right? So that's kind of the lens that I'm also coming at this work. But as someone also who did this, like the outreach work for almost 4 years, I'm a critic in the sense that 12 years later, I see some of the same people doing the same work. And to me, it's a missed opportunity. And I think to myself, that's not equity for me, right? Equity is creating an opportunity where people come in, right? And you invest in that person, right? Because they're an asset to that community, and you see somebody move up the ranks and you give them the supports they actually need. To me, that's kind of how I think about equity. And I'll give you some examples here. Within Heartland Alliance in READI Chicago, in Inglewood, we do street outreach, and then in Austin, we do our traditional job, which these are 2 arms of Heartland Alliance, and then you have my team. I could tell you that out of those in the last couple of years who have left Heartland Alliance, who left these 3 institutions, right, or these programs, that 79% of them actually left for a better job, more pay, more responsibility. And a little bit over 50% of them actually were promoted within the Alliance. Now, that's an advantage that we have because we are a large organization in Illinois. That didn't happen by coincidence. That was very intentional on our end. The fact that we've been able to put over $10 million into the pockets of our participants, tell me another program is able to do that across this country. Because the day one for me is, how do we build equity with outreach staff and other people who are doing this frontline staff? Because we hire people who've been formerly incarcerated or have lived experience, meaning they've been victims of violence as well. So how do we intentionally create upward mobility for them? So one of the things we also did, we increased their pay starting off, right? The second thing that I would say even behind that is that when we think about equity is, how do we develop and train people so that their skill sets could be more marketable for themselves? So staff are being trained, all staff are being trained, for example, on kind of behavioral intervention services. Why? It's a transferable skill that would allow them to actually go into another space, right, and request more money if they chose to. So there's plenty of ways, and these are some of the things that we've learned through READI, I would say, and through our partners, more importantly, is that what we're learning here, the sense of how we look at equity, we're also able to package that and sell that or provide that to other cities nationally too, because the field needs to also evolve. And we here in Chicago, we have this wonderful opportunity that we're evaluating many of our initiatives here. There's a lot of lessons learned that we just cannot just sit on that. We need to further develop that and scale that. as well.
I think, when I think about equity and the relation as Eddie has spoken about, I think about access and opportunity, right? And having that access and opportunity to what you desire. And so in this field, at the Academy, we've had the opportunity to create an MOU with the Kennedy King College. And so as a result, when they finish and complete the 18 weeks of training, those individuals earn 3 continuing education units. Well, what that does is it really incites and inspires our graduates to keep going and to continue on in school. We currently have graduates currently going to NEIU's University Without Walls program, which a lot of our graduates have already graduated from, that improves their leadership capacity. Also, when you think about access, equity, I'm thinking about the lack of it in our communities, which actually really contributes to the violence that we see. And if we want to really improve and truly improve our community situations, we can really begin to examine the social determinants of health to see if we have access to those elements of convenience, such as healthy options in grocery stores. Oftentimes what we see in our neighborhoods is that we can't go from one neighborhood to the other to purchase things because of gang lines or whatever the case may be. However, if we set up our communities to have those elements of convenience, we wouldn't necessarily have to cross those lines. We know one thing about violence, that it does travel. However, I think that we can really reduce what we see in community if we began more intentionality in how we service people in those communities around those social determinants of health.
Yes.
The only thing I can add, one is personal, right? The coalitions we're building starts to look more like Black and brown that are going through the suffering. So always questioning myself, do I still add value? Asking my team, am I adding value? And really very often staying now behind, letting other people like Eddie and Vaughn and others lead in terms of you building the field and where we support it and not. And the relationship of allyship is important, all right? Because so the other side of no allies is it's only the responsibility of Black and brown people to reverse this massive racist oppressive system. So what is the right role? Asking your colleagues, that's a personal journey. Be involved, support, but is your voice too strong? Something that dominates and doesn't allow other people's voice. So this part of it is almost like a gentle dance as well that is important to do. I think Andy started with, we got to be listening. And it's a learning. You all come always, when you're very driven in a field, you come with a lot of energy. So you need to know when do you hold back. And it's a skill. Sal in Providence used to tell me, Teny, you have a big ego. And I was shocked when he said that. And I held it. I still don't completely understand what he said, but I always remind myself that it's really important as you practice with others. But I think we are part of the trauma also. We're in the neighborhoods and we see our staff, what they go through and the inequity. It is absolutely mind-boggling, right? And so to me, in other ways, I channel my anger and what I see, and I need to speak courageously to the larger society and where I have access and keep pushing because I give an example, I'll close with that. As a soldier in Lebanon, Israeli soldier had a better chance coming out alive than an African-American male if he dropped out of high school in Austin has to survive. And that is insane for the richest country in the world. And that stays in the forefront of my mind. I want our young people my kids are now applying to college. I want a kid in Austin to have the same chances. Simple.
Well, I think that's an excellent segue to our closing question because unbelievably it's time. So just a quick lightning round. Where do you want to see the field in 5 years, in 10 years? What is your vision for where we are if and when we do get the chance to come back?
Wow. Definitely a reduction in what we see in our communities, in the violence. You definitely want to see us remedy what we're seeing in our communities, more viable communities based on the work that we're doing. Greater leadership that comes from actually those who are doing the work, boots on the ground, that actually have, through our career pathways that we're developing, have moved up through the ranks, as Eddie has talked about, to actually lead organizations. Some of those leaders actually including female, so a greater female voice as well. So we're hoping that, some of the manifestations that we've seen currently that will continue to evolve in this field. And so a greater trauma-informed community. I know that's a buzzword, but a lot of us are already doing that work, and we don't necessarily know and how we're building right relationship with one another, right? And how we're taking care of one another and checking in with one another. And these are things that we need. All of us have experienced the pandemic. And so although it may have impacted us differently, we've all gone through this traumatic experience together. So that should position all of us to, and impart this our vantage point, really inform our vantage point moving forward.
So I think on my end, I want to start by saying, like, I am extremely optimistic just by nature. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this work. But I'm optimistic because for the first time, we have a president of the United States who's really investing and talking about this issue. He's talking about it through a public health lens, which means that we have an opportunity for the folks in this room and for those who are listening. What does public health really truly mean in this kind of work? And can we expand that vision? And that, to me, is part of the vision. The second thing that I would say behind that is that it's not always just about more money. It's about really, truly being efficient at what we currently have right now, too, to maximize the current opportunities so that we could be in a better position for these future opportunities that are coming out, whether it's with the BBB plan or with this American Recovery Plan funding that we have right now, which we heard from Chris Patterson as well, right? So much effort went behind that. And so I'm hopeful for those reasons. And I think for me, the future really is about not looking and trying to solve homicides, which our city and our state is constantly under a lot of pressure. We're not going to solve that overnight. And we got to stop thinking about that. We need a 5, 10, 20-year plan, just like any major Fortune 500 company is doing. But we don't do that. And too often, we're just focusing on the politics of that. So for me, the future is about thinking long-term. And that means long-term in the way that we are also building an ecosystem. And so there are plenty of examples, whether it's CB4P or READI Chicago, and national examples as well, that we can really draw from. So, and the last thing that I would just say in terms of how and what I hope for the future is that this work is really heavy. It's extremely heavy. And you don't always make friends. And when you do, right, you try to hold on to them. We need to continue to develop this field. We need to. There are so many needs that the men that we serve, and I mean those who are more acutely at risk, there's a specific set of skills that are needed for that particular population. And being formerly incarcerated or being previously in a gang, those are assets, but we got to also think beyond that and how we're developing people. And so for me, the hope and what the future also lies is how we're building the capacity of nonprofits to be able to do this work, how to scale that capacity, and how do we think about strategically in the way that government and philanthropy and nonprofits think about those resources as well. That's how I'm hoping.
So like at 2 in the morning, I wrote a little note that this field is a real paradox. And I think Vaughn mentioned it in his answer. In 30 years, we hope not to be here. I always joke, I want to teach art history, which is how I started with photography. But I was just thinking how much I love the field and still love it and still inspires me because the people that I work with are so incredible, but we don't want to be that incredible. I don't want Eddie to be getting a master's University of Chicago after he spent time in jail for serious crime, right? So just want to meet him like a real nerd. We should have met,
Clearly.
Right. And so, but we're in a really risky moment at the moment, opportunity and risk. And I don't think actually we got to speak about it much. I'm asking Chicagoans, love your sports teams at the moment, love your outreach structures, right? We can always look at somewhere else, the architecture. We built an architecture here that took a real effort and didn't exist 6 years ago. That has coordination, has involvement of the city, has involvement of research institute, but has CRED, READI, CP4P. It's a faith-based group. We just celebrated in Oakland 10 years to live free, national movement that organizes people. We can always look at shiny objects somewhere there. One of the things that scares me about this society is that we jump on new shiny things. Right? This is going to take time to work, and we got to honor now the teams we have here. And I speak now, sorry, as a New England fan. We win more than anyone else, and there's a reason, right? You've got to honor your team. So at the moment, we got to honor what we have in Chicago. I know it's not going to go well, but I want to push us to that, right?
We need some outreach workers in the Rutgers here in a little bit.
You're
Uh,
brave, Teddy.
We gotta really, we have now a structure that can carry us through. And it's not at the expense of others. Smaller groups are gonna get funded, but we need to also honor the boring big organizations like Heartland and MFS and CRED. It's boring, but I was pretty paranoid about big groups, but we cannot carry the day on HR and training and thinking and evaluation and finance and taking care of staff. We do not have the capacity to do that. And we're medium sized and we have good amount of expertise. We cannot do it. We need to understand we have a channel now. There's an operational challenge. Money's coming from Washington says, all right, civilian side of the deal. You don't want police and you don't want just police and just incarceration. You want to show us what you got. And we are not prepared operationally for it. So we need to support everyone who is interested in operations and structures to help carry the day because the odds are still against us.
But we're going to leave with hope.
Yes, we
We're
are.
going to leave with Eddie's note of hope. And please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you.